Well, welcome back. Monday, February 3rd, 2020. I am Seth Leibsohn. A couple things I'm pretty confident of, not because I'm smarter than anyone else, but because I'd like to think I've been around enough, in and around Washington, D.C., and in this political game enough to know the difference between common sense and absurdity, which is the absence of common sense. One doesn't have to be in or of D.C. to have common sense. In fact, some would argue any anonymous American, take your basic Iowa farmer, has more common sense than any anonymous denizen of Washington, D.C. This is, of course, why William F. Buckley once said he'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than the faculty of Harvard. It is for this reason I know a few things. Not a lot, but a few. And bear with me, I'm building up to something here. For example, when Qasem Soleimani was killed, despite all the Chicken Littles pretending World War III and claiming Donald Trump was a warmonger, an insane tyrant with no plan, an irrational actor of this or that order, I knew none of it to be true. Why? Common sense. You take a terrorist, a leading warmonger in the world, off and out of the world, you get less terrorism, less war, not more. You don't get addition by subtraction. Iowa farmers know that sort of thing just as much as the first 2,000 people in the Boston telephone directory know it, too. Experts in Washington who are lefties, guess what? They know it as well. But they had a game to play. Get Trump, get Republicans. And any port in a harbor will do. If it's doing the kind of thing Reagan and Obama did, who cares? Let's get Trump for the same thing. The new cycle is today, and history started yesterday, ends tomorrow. I know one other thing, too, and it borders the notion of common sense. I actually give a damn about civil and human rights, as opposed to those who give it or pay it lip service for political purposes. And when you care about human rights, you kind of pay attention to what dissidents are doing and saying in oppressive regimes and care more about them. You end up caring more about them than their regimes. So, for example, that all those people criticizing Trump for killing Soleimani were moral frauds. For they said not a peep about the 1,500 civilians Iran's government killed 2 months before, last November. We talked about it here. They had nothing to say about them, not in November, not in December, and not in January. They said not a peep for a lot of reasons. Reason one, they don't care about human rights. Reason two, if it hurts Trump, they'll speak. If it helps him, they won't, regardless of how many heads get decapitated. And Trump opposed the leadership of Iran, so that's where they knew where their compass was pointing. But when you have a dissident movement, you get the sense that the people's patience for supporting their oppressors is pretty thin. Easy to do for a day at the barrel of a gun or threat of employment. Easy to do, easy to have a rally, but over the long term, thin, hard to sustain. Which is why you saw the protests in Iran turn the other direction. And if you care about human rights, you care about women's rights. Not for political purposes. It wasn't we, after all, who trafficked with Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein. And so I have to ask, where were the reformers and human rights activists when Iranian women were imprisoned again over this past week and weekend for refusing to wear hijabs? Nowhere to be found. Just as they were nowhere to be found when it became revealed the chief Middle East correspondent for The Economist magazine, while in Iran last year, was detained against his will by that government for over 7 weeks, shuttled from prison to prison. What were they doing? Caring about some Iranians. What were these human rights activists doing? Caring about some Iranian student who was sent back to Iran from Detroit a week or two ago, protesting the Trump administration for sending that student back. We don't know very much about that student, but the ACLU and CARE and a lot of other people got on the Trump administration's case over this. Do they recall? I do. Students were sent back during the Obama administration from Iran. Heck, President Obama signed a law in 2012 banning Iranian students from even coming to America if they were studying engineering. Not a peep from the human rights community. Not the ACLU, not CARE, no one in the left. And not a peep about the hostages in Iran to this day, American hostages to this day. But sending back an Iranian student, which is a lot better than detaining him, which is what Iran does, not a peep. Not a peep about that. But sending back an Iranian student? Yes, that will get their ire up. Why? Because Trump. So where was Linda Sarsour and the Women's March and Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Cortez and Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren this past week during the veil hijab issues in Iran, or across the world for that matter, as there was a hijab awareness weekend? Nowhere to be found. If some smarty pants wants to know what I was doing about it, by the way, well, I was translating tweets from French to English from a journalist on this whole issue so that more could know about it. Massianajad. I'll share them with you later. She gave an interview in France, in a French magazine. It was brilliant. She posted it in French. I translated it, posted it in English. Why am I spending so much time on this? One, because I actually do care about human rights and am sick of posers who are apologists for tyrannies because they want to blame America first and think we're the worst actors in the world, or at least the worst actors when it comes to confronting other tyrannies, or because they think our president is a bigger threat to the world than the real tyrants. Just ask, how many leftists have spoken up about the Muslims being imprisoned in China right now? Millions of them, simply because they are Muslims and their homes mowed to the ground. Heard much about that from the left? Well, Trump is anti-China, so silence. I hate tyranny, and that's why I do speak about these things. And that's why I hated it when Nancy Pelosi met with President Assad and gave him credibility, and when Senator Ted Kennedy, when he was senator in 1984, colluded with the Soviet leaders, actually colluded with them against the re-election of Ronald Reagan. To him, Reagan was worse than their leadership. To Nancy Pelosi, Bush was worse than Assad. I'm fascinated by Blame America Firsters who want to blame all of America for slavery that ended 155 years ago, even though half of America fought against it, while ignoring slavery in our very midst, right now, in places like China today. And one other reason relevant today, because this point about what is real and what is fake, what is asinine political maneuvering and posturing, and what is critical and actual, is relevant to the very impeachment summations we saw today on the Senate floor, and the campaigns for president of the Democratic Party, and several other things plaguing our politics right now. For any Democrat or Democratic activist trying to cast blame on the U.S. Senate right now and have such blame stick for not conceding everything the Democrats wanted in the impeachment of Donald Trump, it's a thin veneer of a crude political talking point. Did the House Democrats really think a Republican Senate was going to follow their lead on the impeachment of a president who broke no laws 9 months before an election? An impeachment they've been talking about and wanting for 3 years. An impeachment they thought they'd get over Russia until it turned out there was no there, so they found Russia's sworn enemy, the Ukraine, and a 5-week hold on financial aid to the Ukraine. Did they really think Senate Republicans would march lockstep with them on that being the new impeachment offense du jour, or that the American people would? If they did, they're idiots. But they are not idiots. They are highly partisan actors and activists that know they have a 2020 problem, a problem called an election they don't believe they will win. They told us that. Adam Schiff told us that when he said 2 weeks ago on the Senate floor, quote, "The president's misconduct cannot be decided at the ballot box," close quote. In his summation today, he repeated it. I actually thought he'd walk that back or try and forget that anyone remembered he said it. He doubled down on it today. They really do believe this. I've never heard such an undemocratic statement in America. The people can't decide, should not be allowed to decide. This is the party that had no set problem with President Barack Obama in March 2012, telling Dmitry Medvedev to communicate the following to Vladimir Putin. Quote, "On all these issues, but particularly missile defense, this can be solved, but it's important for him to give me space. This is my last election. After my election, I have more flexibility." Close quote. That's Obama communicating a message to Putin in advance of a presidential election, telling the Russian leadership not to take him seriously in what he said before the election on our national defense and our allies' defense, because after the election, he would be more flexible. That is to say, more appealing to Russian interests. That's not collusion with Russians. That's not harming our and our allies' national security. Perhaps that's why Russia later thought it could invade Crimea without sanction. Perhaps that's why Russia or Syria didn't take Barack Obama's August 2012 red line threats against Syria too seriously, for they ignored, in a year later, using sarin gas that started a war that killed 500,000 innocents. And no talk of impeachment, and no hell-raising from the human rights community. Why? Why is that? Because we know a farce when we see one, and we know that Democrats who spent 2012's election telling Republicans Russia was not a geopolitical threat, only to turn on a dime when Trump became president, and now it's the biggest geopolitical threat. It reeks of placing political expediency and desire over and against that which serious people, like farmers in Iowa, like the 2,000 first names in any phone book, it makes those serious people not take that seriously. And then when they try and take an election from us, not allowing us to vote on what they say is misconduct, we know what that's really about. And it ain't holding up a few $100 million for 5 weeks. Aid 3 out of the 7 Democratic impeachment managers, 42% of them, didn't even vote to allow it all. Some national security threat, that. One of those managers was Chairman Jerry Nadler. Because end of day, and we haven't seen this in some time, from the Middle East to here at home, common sense has been restored. And the man behind the curtain, who exists by mere threats, smoke, and mirrors, a.k.a. the left and the Democratic Party, they don't like it. Not one bit. Too bad. I'm Seth Leibsohn. We'll be right back. I'd like to take a moment to tell you about my friends at Guns Etc. They are true American patriots. They strongly support our president, and they have over 10,200 square feet of firearms and firearm accessories. Please take my advice and stop by their store, which is a symbol of American freedom, or visit them at gunsetcetera.com and have access to over $350 million in firearms merchandise.